My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. MUFON is really more just left of center, where we try to take a scientific approach by collecting the data first off, and then reviewing the data, investigating the data, and making sure that what we're seeing is actually something that's truly an unknown. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We receive about 500 to 1,000 reports per month from around the world. Field investigators will take the case, generally review it, try to come up with a hypothesis, checking star charts, and we'll go put an investigation in place to determine what exactly happened. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
I have a lot on the agenda today, so let me get started. My main topic, I guess, would be my thoughts on, let's call it a secret space program, from rumor to reality to after disclosure. Just the other day, this article appeared in the Los Angeles Times about NASA. We've all been hearing about NASA, how it's ending its era of manned space flights. This particular piece in the LA Times gets into some detail about how NASA is in danger of really taking a second place or a third place even down the road in the future of global efforts to get people into space. Russia will be renting to the Americans the use of their spacecraft at I think $60 million a pop per person. European Space Agency is studying right now the likelihood and capability of doing manned trips to Mars. In fact, they've got people who are in a kind of Mars isolation environment replication thing there that they're going to be staying in for over a year. China is now ready to launch their first space station. India is working on their second robotic trip to the moon. Other nations as well are getting into the mix, building and launching their own rockets. North and South Korea, Israel, Iran, Japan, maybe others. But keep in mind that the end of NASA's supposed dominance in this era is only one part of the problem, one part of the situation. Space is not going to go away, at least from the U.S. military's point of view. I'm going to read this quote from you. This is regarding the Gulf War of 20 years ago from a very, very fine book called The Future of War by Thomas and Meredith Friedman. The center of gravity of the Allied war effort was the reconnaissance and intelligence satellites the United States had in orbit during the war. If the Iraqis could have destroyed that system, most of the Allied advantage would have dissipated. For the first time in history, the center of gravity of a military operation was located outside the Earth's atmosphere. Keep that in mind. So all those B-2 stealth bombers that were able to hit their targets with incredible precision, this was possible for one reason, which was that the U.S. dominated the theater of operations in space. So space will not go away. 100 years ago, we witnessed the advent of aviation in warfare during the First World War. And just like with satellites today, those original aircraft, their first mission was simply to fly over the enemy and find out where those guys were and then report back. Of course, the enemy started to think, well, we need to shoot those planes down, and it promoted an inevitable escalation in that war. So you have the first true fighter aircraft with machine guns and so on. And each new development spawned another development. It is exactly the same with space. You have space satellites that are designed to spy on the world, and then you have other parties that might be interested in disabling those, and you have an instant militarization and escalation of what's going on in space. That's inevitable. We talk sometimes, we hear things about de-weaponizing space. It's about as likely to do that as it was likely to stop escalation of aircraft in the First World War and beyond. So what I'm saying here is that the end of NASA is a wholly separate issue from U.S. military dominance in space. I don't think any of us can truly imagine that the U.S. military is simply going to walk away from their preponderance of control over space as a theater of operation. And yet we hear very little, don't we, about U.S. military presence in space, despite the fact that those interests there are paramount. My suspicion or analogy that I think of would be with the old Project Blue Book run by the Air Force back in the 50s and 60s. Blue Book was closed in 1969. Really, what was Blue Book by that time? It was a public relations effort by the Air Force, essentially to serve as the mouthpiece on the UFO topic. It had become a hindrance to the Air Force by the late 60s, and the main mission was to kill it. It did not affect UFO reporting through the military chain of command, not at all. NASA may no longer serve much of a useful military purpose. It could very well have been made obsolete by other developments that we just are not privy to. NASA very well may be a hindrance to furthering those missions as well. It's worth considering. After all, as I'll be showing you in a short while, there's been some very interesting video footage that's come out of NASA missions. They're all over YouTube. I'll show you a couple of them. In other words, NASA is itself the source of leaks about clandestine covert activities within that world. It's the source of leaks in terms of video. And so perhaps it was seen as a hindrance in that way. And then also just an easy congressional target in our era today, without a doubt. But again, I would like just to remind you, let's separate NASA from the military component of space. And after all, we know there's U.S. Air Force Space Command, Navy's and Air Force both have significant interests in space. I would point out in the Navy, I have a little laser pointer on this, I guess not. Oh, I do. There we go, right? Can't really see it. In the Navy statement here, space cadre members are currently assigned throughout the national security space arena, including the National Reconnaissance Office, National Security Space Architect. Okay, the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, keep in mind, was itself a secret, completely secret agency for about 30 years. No one knew it existed. It's got a very strong interest in space, obviously. The U.S. has its own history of secret organizations that have existed within the government without people knowing. NRO, the NSA, the National Security Agency, are two prime examples. So in other words, secrecy, big agencies being secret, actually has a long proven history in the national security state. There's no reason, none, really, when you think about it, why that shouldn't be the case today with a military space component or military space program. We have these known ones, and I think there very well could be areas of this that are not known to us. Now, let me just switch gears a little bit. Something exists that is not supposed to exist. We all know what that is. This is about a 1-minute little slideshow I just want you to take a look at some of these images of UFOs from the 40s right up into our own era. Most of these are familiar to researchers who've been in the game for a while. That's the Heflin photograph of 65, Utah 1966, Japan 78, and so on. That's an Iranian shot from 76, another Iranian shot, 78, excuse me, 1981, Hudson Valley. There's a space shot. That's an interesting one in my opinion. 1988, Hudson Valley, Gulf Breeze. Yes, I supported Gulf Breeze in my last book on UFOs. Area 51. Great shot there. A lot of those, people taking pictures of their family and saying, what's that? Australia, 2004. Hungary, I believe. New York State, I don't believe that's a mosquito. And there we go. Okay, so that's something we all know is UFOs. There's something that's here that's not supposed to be here. I got into this business almost 20 years ago now through the lens of looking at military documents. That was always my first and most important focus. It still, to me, is the foundation. When I speak to anyone who's really skeptical about UFOs, and there's a lot of folks like that, I don't try to convince them of anything other than the fact that our military has a proven deep interest in this. And in fact, there are a number of very, very compelling documents that prove that not only is the military interested in this, but that our jets have chased these things, which have outperformed our jets time and again, and not just American jets, but, jets of other nations as well, but certainly the U.S. component of this is huge. These are some of the key documents. I've at other times spoken about them at great length. A couple of years ago, I put together an article that I still think is useful. I call it 12 Documents Proving U.S. Government Interest in UFOs. You can see that at my website. That's Keyhole Publishing. And I would recommend it to you if you are on the fence or want to be convinced that there is an important thing going on that is well documented. This does not prove that UFOs are ET or that they're anything other than something extraordinary that needs explaining. But to me, that's a good place to start. Now let's move on. So we've got military interest in space. That has to be. The U.S. military structure cannot not be interested in control over space. We have a UFO phenomenon that has engaged that military for over 60 years, for sure. We know that that is true. So now what about space? Well, the fact is that it took me a long time to ease myself into this, but there are oddities in space. You might say they're oddities, or you might say that they are possible motivations for a secret space program. In other words, if you've got strange things happening in the atmosphere, in your theater of operations, you might want to check it out. That might be an important part of what you do. After all, we know we know that regarding U.S. air bases in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, when there were violations of the airspace there, we know for sure that this was a matter of concern to the military authorities. And so it would stand to reason if you've got anomalous activity in Earth's atmosphere, the same rule would apply. There would be an interest in investigating and finding out what's going on, but you wouldn't want to do it with the whole world watching you. So when you talk about these anomalies, keep that in mind. And there are a number of these I am going to show you, and it's not really going to take an awful lot of time. And only a few of the STS missions I've really selected for this. This is one from STS 96, just 1999, a little over a decade ago. And let's follow this. Now, the big flashing things in the center are thunderstorms, and that goes on over in the Earth all the time. The items of interest, of course, are in the top right to your point of view. This object right there. These objects moving, kind of creeping along. Flashing object below. I don't know what these things are. But from my perspective, they are very odd, and I think I have a hard time understanding these as debris ejected from the shuttle. And we know that debris is ejected from the shuttle and can be mistaken for all kinds of things, and so I wouldn't want to minimize that, but this looks very odd. Now, this goes on a little bit, and I don't really feel a need to stay on there too long. There's another one I want to show you. Same mission. You have a fast streaking object, and you have a second object that slows down quite noticeably. Now, let's take a look. You can see it a few times. There's the fast object. Okay, now there's the second one, and we'll show that again. Now this is the same one, but slowed down by about 50%. These videos, incidentally, were collected and put up on the web by the late Jeff Challenger, who lived in Sacramento for most of his life. I met Jeff one time. I was a big fan of him. I was very glad I got to meet him before he died in 2007. I'm betting that a couple of his friends are here. He died, and shortly before he passed away, for whatever odd reason, I decided that I wanted to do a complete download of his massive website. I considered it very important. The next thing I know, and I mean 2 days later, I'm not kidding, I learned that he had died. There's a crazy coincidence for you. His old site stayed up for about a year after that, but then that was gone. And I, at a point shortly after that, asked his widow if it would be fine for me to put a mirror of his site up on my own site at Keyhole Publishing, which I've now been able to do. So you can see these videos. Now here's one from the same mission, STS-96. What you'll see are two objects moving perpendicular to each other. This is over New Orleans. There's it going up, and then horizontal. Resolution's not the best, I apologize, but you can see this pretty clearly. Here it is again, slowed down. Again, it seems odd to me. What you find in a number of these cases as well is that the people operating the cameras are very interested in following these debris, if that's what they are. Here's one from another mission, a year later, 2000, STS-106. What you'll see, it's hardest to see in the first take of this. It's actually easier to see when it's sped up. But you'll see a series of objects in a kind of triangular formation moving. Now, the U.S. Navy has NOS satellite, the NOS triplets, which is 3 satellites that orbit in a triangular formation. Their orbit is above that of the space shuttle. So that, I think, can be ruled out. As debris, it seems odd, or seems difficult to explain it since they move in a clear formation with each other, but independently of each other. The sun had not risen, so reflection seems to be a difficult explanation too. So you'll see them. There they are. These are not proof that these things are being piloted by ETs. That's not my point here. It's simply to indicate that it looks like there is activity, sophisticated activity, going on in our atmosphere that maybe some of us would like to know about. Let me show this now. Faster, you'll really see it a little more clearly. There it is. I think it's not too hard to miss. Now here's one that's got some sound. You'll hear a commentator on this. This is funny. You'll see why.
This is approaching sunrise as it approaches the Great Lakes area.
zoom in.
This
Say it.
this a view of Chicago and also some
Come on now.
ice crystals or other items being illuminated by the rising sun. Atlantis moving into sunrise. In just about the next minute or so, as that occurs, ice crystals or water that's been dumped overboard from the shuttle is always illuminated in the close vicinity of the spacecraft. Again, that view of Chicago, though, and the shore of Lake Michigan.
Yeah, Chicago. That's a great view. Here's a zoom in on this object. And just take a good look at this here. It's very, very regular kind of pulsing. Now, I mean, there are images. You can see ice crystals. The images that I've seen of ice crystals in space, they don't pulse this brightly. And plus, the sun had not risen. I don't see how it's valid to say that this is a reflection when it was still in the dark on the before the sun had risen. Now, here's to me the most interesting of all that I've seen. This is STS-114 from 2005, and what you're going to see is an object doing a U-turn, an apparent U-turn in Earth orbit. Take a look at this. And it'll actually slow down and stop for a moment. There's some other activity there, you see, and now it's coming back. One thing I didn't show you, I should have, is there's a close-up enhanced image stabilization version of this in which you can see the object doing very small maneuvers as it moves through space, apparently. So it's going, and it's also doing some very, very specific maneuvers in the process. So that's a little bit of some of the interesting anomalies in our atmosphere, or above our atmosphere, I should say. And again, I would only emphasize that if I, or I'm sure if you were in charge of monitoring the UFO situation, you would be interested in investigating what these things were, and again, you would want to do it in a way that would be secure from outside prying eyes, obviously. So that would be by itself a motivation to have some secrecy in a program in which you're going out into space. Here's the moon. Some odd things about the moon. By the way, I'm reminded of the last U.S. mission to the moon was a military one. It was the Clementine mission, which was a lunar mission to photograph the entire lunar surface. And I personally looked for all the Clementine images, and I don't think that most of them are available. Maybe someone can correct me after the lecture if I'm wrong on that. There are some odd things. Now, this is another sound clip. This is about 2-3 minutes. And these are from two individuals from the Disclosure Project that was run by Stephen Greer. Many of you are familiar with his testimony. Many of you may not be, and I think it's just useful to tell you what they have to say here in their own words. This is Donna Hare, who is a contractor to NASA, and Carl Wolf, who is former Air Force, and they're each going to tell you their stories.
I looked at him, and I was pretty startled because I'd worked out there several years and never seen anything like this, never heard of anything like this. And I said, "Is this a UFO?" And he's smiling at me, and he says, "I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that." What I knew he meant was it was, but he couldn't tell me. So I said, "What are you going to do with this information?" And he said, "Well, we always have to airbrush them out before we sell them to the public."
I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools. I went over. I went into the facility. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. At the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. And I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point. I worked there for 3 more days, and I remember going home and naively thinking, I can't wait to hear about this on the evening news. And here it is, more than 30 years later, and I hope we hear about it.
So yes, Carl Wolf. These images, by the way, this is a YouTube clip that I just thought really worked nicely. The images were not necessarily the same things that he saw, but the person putting it together thought that they worked pretty well. I did too. There's some other interesting elements about the moon that make it interesting. Back in the 70s, I think the first book that really dealt with this issue was by a fellow named George Leonard called Somebody Else is on the Moon. I have this book. I've looked through the images myself, and it's 1976. The images that are in this book are not going to be of the best resolution. It's hard for me to know just what I think of these. Here's one image from the book, though, which he argues it is, and it does look very odd. It's an object. You can see a trail here. Can't see where here we go. Well, you can see it looks like tracks that are apparently going uphill. Maybe they are. Here's another image out of that book, which I thought were somewhat interesting. There's a number of straight lines, and really the interesting business here is on the right side, where you see what looks almost like an old archaeological remain of, if I can point this out here, there we go. This business over here, on the other side, if I can reach, I'm not sure if I assume you can see that. Overall, that book does not actually stir. Yes? Oh, thank you, Jordan. Let's see. You're not supposed to point these into your eye, I heard. Okay, I'll use that when I need it. What's interesting, though, is that book sparked an interest by a fellow named Vito Saccheri in the lunar anomalies. Now, Vito Saccheri I've read a little bit about him. He was an engineer, had apparently an outstanding reputation among his own colleagues. He reads the book and in 1979 goes along with another engineer, a fellow named Lester Howes, to Houston's NASA headquarters and asked to see the moon photos. He had to get approval from Langley, Virginia, presumably CIA. They got it. According to this account, he apparently was the first civilian to have access to see these images. There were strict rules for him. He had 3 days, each 8 hours. You could not take any writing or recording devices in with you, and you could not be left alone with photos. So Sacheri does this, and he writes about it later, of his own seeing in these photographs of what he calls obvious machinery on the surface, showing bolted sections, a UFO rising from the surface and photographed directly above a crater, the unmistakable figure of a rectangular structure placed squarely in the biggest crater pictured, a perfect three-dimensional view. On his final day, he was allowed to examine transcripts of the manned space flights, including the moon landings. What he didn't do in what I was able to read was identify which Apollo mission he's getting this following sequence from. But he says what he read was, Houston, we've got a bogey at 2 o'clock. Roger that, Apollo, switching to Alpha. Roll 8 degrees and begin sequence. From another mission, he says, he read, Mission Control, we've got Santa Claus coming over the hill. Roger, Apollo, hold your fix, switching Bravo. Do you copy? Roger, Houston, Bravo, link. These were, Alpha and Bravo were special designated switching stations that enabled secure communications. That's all that meant. So that's Vito Sacheri's story. Again, so wrapping up with the moon, and there are many other people who claim that there are more significant lunar anomalies than what I've shown you. Again, I'm not convinced personally that all of these are genuine. I don't know. Maybe they are. But I do think that there is enough when I look at the lunar evidence that makes me go, there may indeed be something important about this. The only other thing about the moon that I will tell you is a story that I got from Russell Targ, the remote viewer who worked with Stanford Research Institute, SRI. I got this quite a number of years ago in a conversation where he said to me that in the 1980s he was tasked with training remote viewers out of Fort Meade, Maryland, whose job it was going to be to remote view the far side of the moon. Now, I'm on the phone with him, and I said, well, Russell, wait a minute. I'm playing dumb here. I said, well, why would they be tasked with remote viewing the far side of the moon? And he said, well, why do you think? I said, are they looking for E.T.? He said, yes. That was my understanding. They were looking for E.T. I said, did they find E.T.? He said, well, don't know. If I did, I don't know if I'd be able to tell you anyway, but I don't know. So if you take that for what it's worth, I've known Russell. I think he's truthful with me. You have a situation where remote viewers were tasked with looking at the far side of the moon. There you have it. There's another moon in our system. It's called Phobos. It circles around Mars. It's a big irregular rock. And I think most of us are familiar with the Phobos monolith. I don't know how to explain this. Some people have suggested that this is a piece of impact ejecta. In other words, I suppose what they mean is something slammed into Phobos and left this monolith that's right out of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, because when you look at the shadow, what you see, let's use this good remote here, you see a very squared off top. Look at this shadow. Look at that. I'll show you over here. That shadow is squared off at top. That's one heck of a natural monolith. Now, maybe that's possible, but it's very, very odd. I don't know what this is. Maybe none of us do. Again, I don't know that this is an ET artifact, although why wouldn't it be? Really, why is that so impossible? But again, it's something that would have to stimulate clandestine interest it would seem to me. And then you have Mars itself. I'm not a Mars wonk. I'm not a Mars expert. There are other people who know this better than I do. I try to keep up. Over the years, it's taken me a long time to really seriously consider this. I once had a conversation with another smart guy who has a lot of connections to the classified world, very, very smart man. Years ago, I was sort of feeling him out a little bit about Mars, and this is, I don't know, 02, 03. And I sort of downplayed the Martian anomalies, and he immediately said back, you shouldn't do that. There's a lot of us who are looking at that very, very seriously indeed. I thought, Well, here's an image, of course, of the Cydonia region, the famous region that Richard Hoagland and other writers have talked about. And I have to say, from my own perspective, it doesn't look quite like a natural formation. There's a lot of obvious angles, what they would call rectilinear formations. You got the face, which I look at it, there's different resolutions available. It often does look like a face to me. Whatever it is, again. And then you have Saturn. Now, Saturn's so far out there. Who cares about Saturn? Well, there's some interesting things about it. You've got these odd illuminated sections of the ring structure, which you can easily see from where you're at. There's one there. Over there. I can't see this screen as well, so you have to forgive me if I didn't get it right. Right up there, I believe. I'm not aware of any explanation of what these things are. There's some other better resolution images. This is from the Hubble. Not sure what it is. Could be a fully astronomical explanation. I just would like to hear it. And an elongated object near one of the rings as well that you can see here very clearly. So those are some of the anomalies that we have in our own orbit. So you might think, well, that's fine. So there's some strange things out there. That doesn't mean that we have a program to send, people out there or machines out there to investigate them. After all, these things are expensive. True. After all, do we have even the technology to go out there and do all of this? True. Fair question. Well, let's explore that. Do we have the capability in a secret manner to explore some of these anomalies? So let's take a look. Well, you've got the statement of aerospace journalist James Goodall. This has, of course, I think been known by many people for a lot of years. Goodall wrote for Jane's Defense, Aviation Weekly, Space Technology, other mainstream defense-type publications. Did a lot of interviews. Even before the world learned about Bob Lazar, James Goodall was looking into Groom Lake, Area 51, and the rumors, the UFO rumors that were coming out of there. He had sources that he said told him absolutely, positively UFOs exist. We're talking mid-1980s. That one of which, a guy with 11 years experience at Groom Lake, said to him, we have things out there that are literally out of this world, better than Star Trek. He said, better than anything you can see in the movies. Goodall asked for a lot of follow-up questions and did not get a whole lot of follow-up. But it's very interesting. This photograph, of course, that's a Photoshop image of an object over the, I think this is the Helendale or maybe McDonnell Douglas facility. It's one of the, in the Antelope Valley. Not a real flying saucer there. I don't want to be accused of misleading you. Then you have the journalism of George Knapp out of Las Vegas. Knapp, of course, is the man who spent a lot of time trying to corroborate the claims of Bob Lazar. I realize that not everyone agrees about Bob Lazar, but I really respect what George Knapp has to say about this. He himself said that he developed contacts with about 25 or so Area 51 Groom Lake insiders that did provide significant corroboration to the claims of Bob Lazar. In other words, that there is testing and flying of flying saucers at the Groom Lake facility, or at Papoose Lake, perhaps, right nearby. One of Knapp's sources claimed to see a disc under a tarp at Groom Lake, that is a flying saucer. And significantly, none of them were willing to go public. I think he had a couple of almost coulda, shoulda, woulda, didn't happen. Those of you who know George Knapp, I think you will agree he's a man of great integrity, a stand-up journalist with a lot of courage, and you have to respect what he has to say about this. Then you have the story of the ARV, the Alien Reproduction Vehicle. A number of people have written about this. I wrote about this in Volume 2 of UFOs and the National Security State. It's a heck of a story concerning a gentleman named Brad Sorensen in the aviation industry who claimed that he had went to an air show. He did go to an air show with a very high-level defense official. They were flown from the air show to the real air show, which was at Lockheed's Helendale facility, he said, in a large hangar guarded by guys with M16s. He gets in there scared out of his mind, thinking, I'm not supposed to be here, but his friend, this senior defense official, says, just don't say anything and I'll get you through this. It's cool. They go in, and behind the curtain, he sees three, he says, perfectly hovering flying saucers that kind of look like this. This is a cutaway illustration. They were hovering. They were not suspended by tethers. And when you read his account that he gave to the aviation illustrator Mark McCandlish, Sorensen was very, very explicit. And he was he said, almost hyper-aware. His whole brain was turned on into high gear, observing everything. And he said that there was a 4-star general giving a lecture at a podium talking about these objects as the alien reproduction vehicles that had traveled throughout the solar system. This is 1988. Sorensen said, indeed, when he looked at the large one, it looked like it had gone through the paces. It was kind of beat up looking. Interesting. There's more about that. My point in showing this to you is I think he seems to be telling the truth. That's my opinion. Statements of Clark McClellan, who was a former spacecraft operator with NASA for many years, working with the shuttle fleet. I'll read this statement that Clark put out on the internet. I've spoken with Clark myself a few times. He's a very interesting man. He's got a lot to say. He says here, there are many mysteries that have been discovered during the years we've been exploring the moon, sun, and planets. And he gives a Ben Rich story here. Let me just read it. The former CEO of the Lockheed Skunk Works was visiting the Cape Canaveral many years ago. I asked him a question. Ben Rich said, Clark, black budget dollars have taken the U.S. military at least 50 years beyond the present understanding of the general public and how far we are technologically advanced. You have no idea where we have gone out there. That's Ben Rich. Clark said, Mars, sir? He looked at me and his head movement said yes. Clark concludes, he says, are there monuments on the moon, Mars, etc.? Bet on it. Just another guy's testimony, I guess you could say. But again, when you start putting these together, you really have to wonder, is this business going on? How would you manage all of this? How do you keep it from leaking out to the public? It's a good question, something that I've pondered about myself over a number of years. There's a couple of, not many, but there's a few pretty good studies that have been done on the whole world of special access programs. One was done a little over a decade ago by aviation aerospace journalist Bill Sweetman. Bill Sweetman, to my knowledge, I've never spoken to him. He's never written, to my knowledge, about UFOs, but he's written an awful lot about Groom Lake. A little over 10 years ago, just at the very end of the Clinton administration, he wrote an article on called In Search of the Pentagon's Billion-Dollar Hidden Budgets, how the U.S. keeps its R&D spending under wraps. Talked about these special access programs. At that time, he said he estimated there were at least 150. That seems to be a low number. His own opinion is that they had no, or let's say little to no oversight. Many of them, he said, were unacknowledged, and all that meant is that they weren't supposed to exist officially, but of course they did. An interesting thing about them, he pointed out, is that at least in his own understanding, his own investigation, they had independent classification systems, so that, in other words, if you were running one of these, you would create your own system that would be, in theory, independent of other classification systems, for maintaining the secrecy. If you would decide who's in and who's out as well. If a 4-star general wanted in and you said, no, I've got my childhood buddy here who I trust a little more, then it's the childhood friend who's in and not the 4-star. One of the other key things that he mentioned, maybe the key thing, is that he said they seem to be dominated not by U.S. Defense Department personnel as much as by the private contractors. Interesting statement. So in other words, not the Navy or the Air Force or Army, but rather Lockheed or Boeing or Raytheon or whoever the dominant contractor was. He said no idea how they got all their money. More recently, about a year ago, in fact, around this time, Dana Priest and Bill Arkin of the Washington Post did a very interesting study. The fact that it appeared in the Washington Post is one of the most interesting things of all. A really good piece of journalism here. Not that the Post is incapable, but I think many of us in the UFO field understand that the Washington Post has bent over backwards to dismiss the topic that we study here as nonsense, and really hasn't done an awful lot of real deep investigation of the intelligence community either. But they did in this case. Really, the conclusion of this excellent multi-part series, which I would encourage you to read, is that the intelligence community's secrecy is out of control. It's out of control. Massively privatized. Way more than 150 special access programs. They didn't really know, but they were thinking thousands. A defense and intel community that is immense, unwieldy, and secretive. No one knows how big it is, how many people work for it, or even whether it's making us any safer as a nation. A damning indictment. I don't think there's been a whole lot of follow-up in the public sector on that piece of journalism. I think there certainly should be. I want to talk a little bit about the secrecy iceberg, as they sometimes call it. When we're talking about UFOs, or really any topic that affects national security, we've got a lot of layers of secrecy. Above, as you know, with any iceberg, the real mass is below the water. And it's the same with secrecy. It's the same with government documents in general. There's a recent study, recent book, I should say, called Blank Spots on the Map by a fellow named Trevor Paglen, in which he stated that the best estimates that he could find of U.S. government secrecy is that about at least half, and listen to this carefully, at least half of all U.S. government documents are in one manner or another classified. That was his estimate. It's an estimate. Okay, he could be wrong. But if you think of it this way, okay, that as a historian or as an archivist, someone trying to put together the history of your government, you could legitimately say that more than half of your government's history is secret. That's one way to look at it. When we look at the secrecy iceberg, let's look at some of the UFO documents, some of the more famous ones that have come out over the last number of decades that people like myself and other researchers hold up as proof of government interest in UFOs, and indeed they are. But in terms of the levels of secrecy, they're not really very deep. At the top of the iceberg, you have public and open sources. That's where most of us ply our trade if we're doing any kind of research, right? You go into what's already out there, and then declassified, and there's an unclassified layer. In other words, these are not documents that are formally, like you would be allowed to read them, except that you would probably be very hard-pressed to find them, kind of really squirreled away within the massive government bureaucracy. You got to be really good to find them. And then you start getting into layers of secrecy. Well, the Twining memo of 1947, in which Nathan Twining states that the phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious, describes the military reports of these flying saucers, round on top, flat on bottom, and so forth. That was secret. That's not too bad. You have a 1949 memo of the FBI. That's a very interesting one indeed, stating, among other things, that the topic of UFOs was top secret. That memo itself was only confidential. One of my favorite memos in all of this business, a 1952 memo by H. Marshall Chadwell. He was the director of intelligence for CIA, writing to his boss, Walter Bedell Smith, director of the CIA, talking about that UFOs did not appear to be natural phenomenon or known types of aerial vehicles. A phenomenal memo. That was secret. Below that, you've got top secret. When you go through the history of FOIA documentation, Freedom of Information, that we've received, almost none of them have even been at the level of top secret, and the very few that have were almost all redacted, that is blacked out or whited out. But beyond that, you've got the special access programs, the unacknowledged. You've got then the private contractors. Their stuff isn't so much classified as it is proprietary. Keep that in mind. And then, of course, you've got the secrecy by these other beings, them. So there's lots of layers of secrecy that we're just not getting. Here's another one. Very interesting. Airspace violation over Oak Ridge, 1951, confidential. You get the idea. A couple more. The Malmstrom incident, which it certainly seems that a UFO of some sort disabled a series of nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base. That was a secret. Okay. So there's a lot of secrecy. You get the idea. There's also a lot of money that very well is available to play games with a secret space program. We have black budgets. Everyone's heard about the black budget at this point. You get different estimates as to how large it is. The New York Times estimated back in 2008 that it was $32 billion. Seems kind of small to me. Even back then, U.S. military budget was over $400 billion. I'm pretty sure. It's now we're over $500 billion. 2009, Wired magazine said the black budget was about $50 billion. I don't know. 20 years ago, Tim Weiner, in his book Blank Check, estimated the black budget at $30 billion. That was 20 years ago. Has it gotten smaller? You have statements that there are trillions of dollars that have gone missing. This is probably the most famous one of several. Donald Rumsfeld, this is early on in the Bush years, talking to the House Armed Services Committee about $2.3 trillion in transactions. Actually, here his original statement was $2.6 trillion. That we can't account for this. Now, that's 8 times the Pentagon's budget at the time. I looked into this, trying to figure this out, and it is not necessarily a case at all that $2 trillion were lifted out and stolen. I don't think that actually happened. What you have are accounting discrepancies. Like if you balance your checkbook, you try to reconcile your statements. The Pentagon back then had hundreds, I think 200 or more separate computerized accounting systems at that time, and it was a mess. So a lot of that was, we're told, resolved. But here's the problem with that. Okay, so they supposedly got the number down from 2.6 to 2.3. Then a year later, it was down to less than $1 trillion. Nice progress, guys. And then a couple of years after that, a number of years later, we're told that that number was down to 0. Now, at this point, I really have to beg, to differ and ask, come on, what are we talking about here? Obviously, you've got a general at the top who says, get that number down to 0, and that's the end of it. And so they made it happen. This is an old game with Pentagon number playing. They've been doing this for years. They did it in Vietnam, famously, over the North Vietnamese order of battle, shortly before the Tet Offensive, in which the Pentagon massively, for totally political reasons, downplayed, underestimated the North Vietnamese total order of battle until they were rather embarrassed at Tet. But are we missing trillions of dollars? Well, it's not just the Pentagon. You have a global financial system, which the more you look into this, the more it looks like there's a massive game of theft going on. One of my favorite books that I've read in the last few years was John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I'd recommend it to if you're interested in looking into this. What he describes is how financial manipulators at a global level are charged with siphoning money out of out of entire nations, essentially just robbing them blind. This is an article from about 5 years ago saying the global financial system seems to have a black hole at its center. This is 2 years before the great financial collapse. How can $2.7 trillion disappear? Money just goes away. So could some of this money find its way into all kinds of other black budget programs? Is the black budget simply, your tax dollars at work, or is the black budget coming from sources beyond your tax dollars? I think that when you look at the history of such activities as international banking fraud, narco-trafficking, what you find are intelligence community connections again and again. Not just CIA, incidentally, although definitely CIA. Think back to the Nugan Hand financial scandal or the BCCI financial scandal. CIA is all over these. Money laundering operations. Look, if you are going to engage in all manner of clandestine activities, some of which may not be considered cricket by the rest of the world, you may not want to have to get your money from Congress. It would certainly be nice if you have other sources, unvouchered sources of income that you can just have as your own slush fund. Everyone wants that money. Everyone. All the global intelligence agencies want it. And some of it could very easily find its way into some of these programs that I'm talking about. I don't know this for sure. Okay, so I want to be careful about that. What are these secret programs about? I've talked about this a few times. I think number one is about making UFOs. Number two, it's about studying these, studying bodies that have been acquired. I believe that that's happening, conducting biotech research as a result of that. Of course, one that I've been talking about for a while is developing a secret space program. Another, let me click this, here we go. Well, another is simply about stealing money, using free money to conduct your research and to provide security around the program. In other words, a secret program is about collecting funds so it can do what it does. It's also about making a profit from this acquired technology. That's not hard to understand. If you have a piece of ET technology that you're allowed to study, well, you can probably get some nice ideas on how to develop that commercially for your own benefit. Absolutely. It's about hiding most of this from the U.S. military and allied militaries. And it's about using U.S. military and other militaries to protect their stuff. In other words, who knows who the U.S. military is working for at times? And of course, we have to keep in mind it's also about dealing in whatever fashion possible with the presence of these non-humans. I've talked a little bit about a breakaway civilization. This is a theory that I've worked on for a couple of years. What happens when you have total secrecy? You have lots of geniuses working for you. You've recovered alien tech, and you've got almost unlimited amounts of money. Well, you would have a lot of time to develop what we might call an invisible empire. You would have technological breakthroughs at some point that would take your science well ahead of the rest of the world. And this, of course, was what Clark McClellan hinted from his statement that he said he got from Ben Rich. What is a civilization? Ask yourself. It's a lot of things, but one of the things that defines it, I would say, would be the level of technology you're at, your social structure and so forth, your cosmology, your thoughts about your place in the world. In all of those areas, this classified world might truly have developed understandings of the cosmos, perhaps even had breakthroughs in what we would call field propulsion or anti-grav technology that would allow them to go off planet. It certainly would not be something that they'd be able to share with the rest of the world. They would feel necessarily that that's not a good thing that we want to share. If you, this is not advancing, I hit the wrong thing there. So I call it a breakaway civilization. In other words, a separate civilization, one that's in a sense broken away from our own. That doesn't mean that they all live on Mars in Alternative 3. It simply means that they are here, but that in their working environment, they are dealing with realities that are so very far beyond what we ordinarily deal with in our own life. So my ultimate theoretical scenario is that there's maybe a Cold War going on that we don't know about. Lots of groups interested in us and our world. A possible quarantine. I also think there's multiple human groups involved in this, not all. I don't think there's one cover-up group anymore. I think there could be multiple cover-up groups with varied agendas, all of which probably concern themselves with getting access to this ET tech and maybe other secrets as well. It's a big secret. It's being hidden from us, but it won't be hidden from us forever. And this takes me to the next section. I've got, I see I have 15 minutes. I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. For many years, I've described disclosure as the paradox. It's inevitable. It's impossible, but it's inevitable. I do believe it's inevitable. Change, we're living in the period of the most dramatic change in human history. And we forget. Every single day we wake up, we kind of forget that. But think about the last 20 years. Forget the last 50 years. It's unrecognizable, and this change is unstoppable. In a sense, I think what's going to happen is it's a matter of time before something happens that's going to force this issue out in the open. We're developing ways globally to communicate with each other that were not even considered a mere generation ago. What's our world going to look like in another 20 years? Ask yourself, in terms of our ability to have global conversation, to research things, to find things out. We have WikiLeaks now. Didn't exist 10 years ago. Couldn't exist 10 years ago. Okay? So, something's going to happen. When that dam breaks, we're going to have a whole lot of questions that are going to be very, very unpleasant to ask. Who are they? What are they? What do they want? Are we safe? How have you kept this secret from us all these years? There's a fun one to ask. That's going to get into this whole nasty mess that I've been touching on here. What is the status of our secret tech programs? Where's the proof? That'll be a tough one. You wouldn't want to be the president and have to answer these questions. What do we do? Well, most of that I was very privileged to write about with my co-author Bryce Zabel in our book AD After Disclosure. That came out almost a year ago, and I have it here. You can buy it at the end of this lecture if you're interested, or you could at least read through it and put it back on the table. That's cool too. All that it is our exploration of this issue, our own attempt to sort of see, with our feet on the ground, hopefully, how things might play out. I think disclosure will open up a big old mess on us. It will take us 20 years or more to work through. I don't think it's going to be a simple issue. Here's one reason: energy. Maybe the core issue, because whatever these UFOs use, it's not oil. And we're going to be very clear about that. And so right off the bat, people are going to be asking, well, what is it? Is it zero-point energy? Is it some form of nuclear fusion? Is it something different? Whatever it is, it's not oil. And it will then threaten one of the most predominant industries in our world, one in which much of our global financial system hinges on. It's going to be a little messy. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. We should make this transition, because I think we all know that our oil economy is a thing that is only going to be temporary. We can't go like this forever. We're going to have to change at some point soon. And the UFO issue, this is one of the key practical areas of import. There's an answer there, whatever that answer is. Geopolitical unrest is going to follow, there's no question. Riots. You look at the Middle East, the Arab Spring of 2011 that we've been talking about. That happened like that. And other sparks can happen equally fast. The secret about UFOs comes out. You think there won't be a million-person march on Area 51? Wackenhut can stop 10 or 20 or 50 people. It's not going to stop 1 million people from going in there. Not to say that it will happen, but maybe it will. The world can change on a dime. Revolutions don't happen slowly. The revolutions happen fast. French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. These things were quick, and they were also not foreseen much in advance of what they happened. Lots of questions, and it's going to open up our history in ways that are going to surprise us, I think. Political leadership is going to have to make some real tough choices. Everyone knows, I think, we can recognize that political leadership the world over is beholden to very powerful interests that stand behind it. I've at least made this argument for a number of years. I think it's true. When it comes right down to it, people get angry over the secrecy, U.S. President and other responsible leaders are going to have to choose. Who am I going to side with? The guys who put me in power, that is the secret keepers, let's call them the Illuminati, the breakaway civilization, whatever they are. Or am I going to step up and side with the people and try to break down this black budget world that has dominated this topic since forever? Is there someone in the world who's going to have the courage to do this? I don't know, but I think it's possible. I think we'd be fools to deny that it's a possibility. We have a rendezvous with destiny. I think that, among other things, disclosure will energize our push to explore beyond our world. Of course it will. We're going to see for sure that there are other beings out there. They can get here. Well, let's go there. Stan Friedman has pointed out, with a great deal of insight, I might add, about how these other beings probably look at us and think, no, they're a little too scary to let them out of the cage. Well, I think, yeah, we are. We're terrified of the ET threat to us, at least some people are, but humanity certainly, is no denying, has done the most horrific things to itself and to this world, beyond anything that I can imagine what ETs will have done, at least that I know of. Having said that, I don't believe that we're inherently evil. I do believe that we have the ability to be better than what we are. And part of what we need is truth. What we need is truth to help that. One of the ultimate ironies is that the Majestic group, let's call them that, the breakaway group, whatever, is probably attempting to deal with this problem, and they themselves may not know who they're dealing with. So that in a post-disclosure world, we may not have a whole lot of answers. We may just have a whole lot more questions. That's a real possibility. And again, I think it could take a long time before some of those questions are resolved, but that's okay. In the long scheme of things, it'll all come out. Times are tough for humans throughout all of our history. It's no different for us. Now, the last thing I wanted to state is I want to talk about the future, not just of space, not just of the ET presence and of disclosure, but of ufology itself, because that's what we do. We study UFOs. Now, I had thought about this, and I just sort of threw this together at the last minute. And my thoughts on ufology are this right now. We live in an age of YouTube. We live in an age of copy and paste, the latest thing that we've heard. Every single week, I get multiple queries from people asking me to analyze this video or that photograph. Rich, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I say the same thing every single time. I look at it. I read what other smart people who have studied this more than I have had to say about it. I consider the matter. But every single time I say, until there's an independent investigation, a real investigation done, interviewing witnesses to start, then I don't have an opinion on it. How can I know? There are thousands of UFO videos on YouTube that are out there, and from an investigative point of view, from a research point of view, they're of very limited value to me. It's not to say that they're useless. It's just to say that what is necessary to make them valuable is an independent investigation. The real heroes of UFO research are the people who conduct these types of investigations. This is where MUFON is so important. Within MUFON, you have the field investigator. And these are people who are really ultra dedicated and spending usually their own time and money to go out and investigate cases that the rest of us need. We need these investigations. We need confirmation. For years and years and years, for over 40 years, MUFON field investigators have gone out there, they've dotted the I's, they've crossed the T's, they've debunked the garbage cases, and they've held up the genuine ones to the best of their ability within very limited means, and yet they've done it. And so there's a lot of folks out there who study UFOs in a casual way, and they forget this. They want to talk about the conspiracies, things that I like to write about. The secret space program, well, that's all interesting. The control group, all of that's interesting. Who are these other aliens, these other beings? Are they aliens? Are they from another dimension? Yes, yes, yes. But we forget that what's necessary is a feet-on-the-ground, pragmatic investigation, case by case, at least until we get a disclosure, at least until we get the full answer. Field investigators have done the lion's share of the real work in moving this topic ahead, and they deserve our utmost gratitude and thanks. Now, that's a core part of what any UFO investigative group has to do. Regarding the future for MUFON, I think everyone in this room has been aware of all kinds of controversies that have been discussed over the last year and more. I'm not taking sides on any of this. I want to make it clear to you right now. But as someone who's writing the history of this, I felt an obligation to understand for myself just what is going on with this fine organization, which to me personally is very important, and I think which to all of us is very important. We need a healthy MUFON for the future of ufology. There have been, of late, a number of defections by some key, stellar people from this organization. Over what? Over suspicion of how MUFON has been run. And again, I don't pretend that I know the answers. I've tried to. But some of these claims have been very troubling to me, and I think to many of you. Claims about an opaque nature of the structure of power of the board, an unresponsiveness to the needs of the people in the organization itself. There have been calls for elections of the board members, and we're all aware of this, and I know the matter's been dealt with. At least the board has taken its own steps, I understand. But really, what is necessary? All right? Without getting into the truth matter of the claims, I would simply suggest to the board of MUFON, most of whom I know and I think are good people, that they need to be on top of this. And they need to realize that MUFON as a volunteer organization needs dedicated people who believe in the integrity of that organization. And it's not just people inside, it's outsiders who look in. It takes 5 minutes on the web to search this out, and you see suspicion from all quarters of this really excellent organization. But there's a lot of suspicion. And responsible leadership needs to understand that the moment for real change and for adaptability in a changing world as such that we have is always right now. And there's a strong need for this responsiveness because just as NASA is now in danger of losing its leadership in the civilian world of space exploration, hey, it could happen to MUFON in the field of UFO research. Stranger things have happened. Other organizations have already formed to compete. Whether or not that's going to go anywhere, well, I don't know in this particular case, but it's a symptom. When you have a good organization, or when you have a long-standing organization that loses good people who are talking about this publicly, explicitly, I might add, making some very serious statements, then you've got a problem that has to be dealt with in a forthright way so that UFO research can continue in a way that inspires our confidence and inspires our respect. I really believe this organization is up to it. I don't know if all of the challenges will be met, but I believe that they will be met, and I certainly would call on the board to think about that very carefully. I think they're up to it as well. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. My website is Keyhole Publishing, afterdisclosure.com. I'll be around all day to talk to you. Thank you very much.
is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
I have a lot on the agenda today, so let me get started. My main topic, I guess, would be my thoughts on, let's call it a secret space program, from rumor to reality to after disclosure. Just the other day, this article appeared in the Los Angeles Times about NASA. We've all been hearing about NASA, how it's ending its era of manned space flights. This particular piece in the LA Times gets into some detail about how NASA is in danger of really taking a second place or third place even down the road in the future of global efforts to get people into space. Russia will be renting to the Americans the use of their spacecraft at I think $60 million a pop per person. European Space Agency is studying right now the
My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our
for one reason, which was that the U.S. dominated the theater of operations in space. So space will not go away. 100 years ago, we witnessed the advent of aviation in warfare during the First World War. And just like with satellites today, those original aircraft, their first mission was simply to fly over the enemy and find out where those guys were and then report back. Of course, the enemy started to think, well, we need to shoot those planes down, and it promoted an inevitable escalation in that war. So you have the first true fighter aircraft with machine guns and so on. And each new development spawned another development. It is exactly the same with space. You have space satellites that are designed to spy on the world, and then you have other parties that might be interested in disabling those, and you have an instant militarization and escalation of what's going on in space. That's inevitable. We talk sometimes, we hear things about de-weaponizing space. It's about as likely to do that as it was likely to stop escalation of aircraft in the First World War and beyond. So what I'm saying here is that the end of NASA is a wholly separate issue from U.S. military dominance in space. I don't think any of us can truly imagine that the U.S. military is simply going to walk away from their preponderance of control over space as a theory.
MUFON is really more just left of center, where we try to take a scientific approach by collecting the data first off, and then reviewing the data, investigating the data, and making sure that what we're seeing is actually something that's truly an unknown. We have 3,000 members worldwide, Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We receive about 500 to 1,000 reports per month from around the world. Field investigators will take the case, generally review it, try to come up with a hypothesis, checking star charts, and we'll go put an investigation in place to determine what exactly happened. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization.
Likelihood and capability of doing manned trips to Mars. In fact, they've got people who are in a kind of Mars isolation environment replication thing there that they're going to be staying in for over a year. China is now ready to launch their first space station. India is working on their second robotic trip to the moon. Other nations as well are getting into the mix, building and launching their own rockets. North and South Korea, Israel, Iran, Japan, maybe others. But keep in mind that the end of NASA's supposed dominance in this era is only one part of the problem, one part of the situation. Space is not going to go away, at least from the U.S. military's point of view. I'm going to read this quote from you. This is regarding the Gulf War of 20 years ago from a very, very fine book called The Future of War by Thomas and Meredith Friedman. The center of gravity of the Allied war effort was the reconnaissance and intelligence satellites the United States had in orbit during the war. If the Iraqis could have destroyed that system, most of the Allied advantage would have dissipated. For the first time in history, the center of gravity of a military operation was located outside the Earth's atmosphere. Keep that in mind. So all those B-2 stealth bombers that were able to hit their targets with incredible precision, this was possible